All right, so just a couple quick things before we get started here. We're going to be going over the single image processing. We're going to be going over panoramas. We're going to be going over the blended exposures, and we're going to be going over the image stacking. What we will not be going over is some of the time-lapse stuff, just because Gunther already has like a really good tutorial on his website for doing this stuff. We could have recorded, a 15-20 minute clip ourselves, but you know, it's best to go to the source. This is the person who actually created the program. Um, so we're just going to put a link to this section of his website. It's on the LR Timelapse website under tutorials. Um, there's no sense in us recording one when there's already, a video on how to use this program from the person who actually created it. Just keep in mind that your processing for your time lapse is going to be very similar to the other stuff that we go over. So the actual astro processing, you'll have an understanding of, and then if you need to just remember how to actually go through the step-by-step process for using Lightroom time lapse and Lightroom to create your time lapses, this is where you want to be. And just another thing, we we put a lot of time into this. And we would really appreciate it if you didn't share this with anyone who didn't take the workshop. All this stuff is copyrighted, but more importantly, it's just, we put a lot of work into this, so just please don't be sharing this with all your buddies. And that's about it. So we're going to get started and just jump right into the single image processing. And if there's anything that we missed, we're human. Maybe we forgot one particular thing that we went over during the workshop, or there's something that you see that we forgot during these videos, just post about it in the alumni group or shoot us an email or whatever, and I'll just record another quick video for anything that we may have missed. So I think this is pretty comprehensive, but if there's anything that you see that is missing, just let us know and we'll get that sorted out for you. Hey everyone. So first of all, just thank you for being patient with us getting these notes over to you. We're actually doing something a little bit different this year. Instead of giving you PDF files with just like actual notes, we're going to be doing screen recording. That way it's a little bit easier to follow along, and that way if you kind of forget something or you need to be reminded, you can actually just watch the clip over again. I always find it's easier to see stuff in video, so we're going to do this year. So the first thing we're going to be going over is the single image processing. This is probably going to be the longest clip because every technique after this is pretty much just building off of the single image processing. So this one's probably going to be a little bit longer, but let's just get started here. So this is an image. It's actually an image taken from a panorama in Acadia, but we're going to be just working on the single image processing for this, and then later on we're going to be going over the stitching. So once it's imported into Lightroom, we're going to go into the develop module, and the first thing I'm going to do here is just push the exposure a little bit. I actually shot this at ISO 12,800, which is a little bit longer than I would typically go. I also shot it at 25 seconds, which is kind of pushing things a little bit at 15 millimeters. If I zoom in, you can see a little bit of trailing. I knew that this photo was only going to be shared online. I probably wasn't going to print this panorama, so once it's scaled down to web size, you don't really see the trailing as much. But if this was something that I was going to try to print, I probably would have only gone for 20 seconds. But anyway, so the first thing I'm going to do is just push the exposure slightly, maybe like half a stop, and drop my highlights a little bit to retain some of this detail here. A lot of times I like to push the exposure slightly just before starting to work on my white balance. Just makes things a little bit easier to see. Now, there's a few different ways you can set your white balance. Over time, you start to kind of learn what you need as far as adjustments, but one thing you can do, and I went over this during the workshop, is just push your vibrance and your saturation to 100% and zoom into an area that's doesn't really have much going on. It's not really good to use an area down here closer to the horizon, because you'll get some different colors. Sometimes it's from air glow, sometimes it's just from ambient light or whatnot, you know, if you're shooting towards some light pollution. So I always try to go kind of in one of the top corners. And you really want to, you know, for the temp, when you start to set your temp, you want to just make sure that there's some color in your stars. I shot this at 3800 Kelvin, so there's already some good color in some of these stars, but there's a little bit too much green, and that's where you start to set your tint. If you know, you can see that there's a little bit too much green in this. It's like kind of overwhelmingly sort of a green cast. So I'm going to add some purple and get it looking just a nice mix of kind of purples and green color. Something even. That looks decent to me. I'll just double click these to bring it back to 0. And that's looking pretty natural to me. You know, usually I'll bump up the vibrance and saturation, get it in the neighborhood I know it needs to be in, and then once I bring these back to 0, I'll make some final tweaks. Just kind of play around with the sliders just to get it to look right. Basically, you want to have like a faint kind of yellowish color in the core. This is sort of the most important area to pay attention to. Just getting sort of natural colors in your Milky Way core. It looks a little bit washed out and desaturated, but I'd rather have it be sort of flat and neutral before bringing it into Photoshop. And if we need to add some color saturation later, it's something we can easily do. So I'm also going to just push my whites a little bit just to get the stars kind of popping, you know, bring the focus really to the sky. And maybe push my shadows just a little bit. Depending on your camera, that'll kind of decide how far you can push your shadows. On the Nikon sensors and the Sony sensors, you can typically push things a little bit harder. Unfortunately, with Canon, you're just not going to have that luxury. You know, if you start to push your shadows too much, it's going to look pretty foul, honestly. And now I'm just going to do my lens correction. So I always click the Remove Chromatic Aberration box. And then, depending on the lens you use, I find that Lightroom's lens corrections tend to be a little bit too aggressive. We can check it here and see how it does, but especially with the vignetting, I feel like it really goes overboard. Just turn this on and off quickly. You can see it's just, like I said, I just find the lens profiles in Lightroom to be a little bit too aggressive, so we're going to do this manually. If you're happy with how your automatic lens profile corrections look, then that's fine. I'm not actually going to have it fix any of the distortion because I don't really see too much. You know, if this horizon was placed closer to the bottom or the top of my frame, where the distortion of wide-angle lenses is more pronounced, you'd see that the horizon would have more of a curve to it, but because it's closer to the center of the frame, you're not going to see as much like stretching. But what you do see is some vignetting, you know, in the corners here. So we're going to fix that. The way I do that is I go over to the manual panel of the lens corrections, and I'm going to just pull up the slider for the amount. That looks much better up here. And then I'm also just going to set the midpoint, and this will just bring sort of some more, it'll just make it look a little bit more even. And that looks good to me. I'm pretty happy with this. Noticing that it still looks a little bit green. I'm wondering if I can fix some of that. I don't want to go too purple. Maybe something like this is good. You'll see it a lot of times like in your foreground when you have that color cast as well. Those are the two areas I really pay attention to, is just the core, like the brightest part right here, making sure this is, you know, closer to a like pale yellow color, and then I don't have like an overwhelming color cast in the foreground. This is still looking like a little bit like kind of greenish, whatever, but for now this will be good, and we can always tweak this slightly if we need to. And Oops, sorry, I had to pause it for a second there. Dogs are barking. That may be a common trend for this, hopefully not, but anyway, so this is looking pretty good for me. Real quick, I'm just going to go into the crop module, this little box here, and just check the horizon. Looks like it's pretty close, but I think it needs just a small adjustment, something like that. Maybe not. These are just all like little things I check as I'm going through. It doesn't necessarily need these adjustments, but I always just look over them first just to make sure. So at this point, I'm pretty happy with how this is looking, and I'm going to bring this stuff over into Photoshop. Now you'll notice that these are just the notes. It's meant to be more of a refresher than like an actual lesson. So I'm going to move through some of these steps, fairly quickly. But the nice thing about the video is that you can go back and just watch stuff over if you need to be reminded. So, I think I mentioned during the workshops that I don't really do a whole lot in Lightroom. It's mostly just getting things looking sort of flat and neutral before I bring them over into Photoshop, where I can do some heavy lifting as far as adding contrast and color and all that type of stuff. So, so once this thing is looking pretty good, just going to right click and go to Edit in Photoshop CC. Alright, so now we have the image opened up into Photoshop, and we can actually start doing some like more, actual processing. The first thing I'm going to do, and this step varies like when I do it depending on how I feel, but I'm just going to clone out some of this stuff. We had a couple satellites go through the frame, and I want to get rid of those right now. So the first thing I'm going to do is duplicate this. That way we always have our original layer to go back to if we really need it. First thing I'm going to do is just click the little lock icon, unlock that, and I'm going to duplicate this layer. Now there's like a bunch of different ways you can do this. You can right click and click duplicate layer. You can click and hold this and drag it over this little page icon here, or you can hit Control or Command J. One of the things that you'll have by the time that I give everyone this video is the list of Photoshop shortcuts. I really, really recommend trying to learn those. It'll just make things really fast. But so now that we have our duplicate, we can start making some adjustments. I like using the spot healing brush. It's like this little band-aid type looking icon here. I find this works the best, making sure it's set to normal and content aware. I like using that. And if you just click and drag with like a smaller brush, you don't want to have it super small, but you don't want to have it too big either. It does a really nice job at cloning stuff out. There's actually a really faint one right here. Good. Now, if you have a satellite going through, these other spots were pretty easy to clone out because there really wasn't much. It's like a consistent texture and background. Let's say you have one going through your core. I don't like to just drag the entire thing all at once because there's a lot of different things that it needs to match as far as texture. So I'll do like a little bit at a time. That way it doesn't look too funky and tries to match texture with a spot that it shouldn't. That looks pretty good. Just turn this on and off. You can see a little bit where I cloned it out, but only because you know where you just went over. If you ask someone to look at your image and pick out where you cloned out satellites, I don't think they'd ever be able to figure it out. That looks good to me. Now, I want to start adding contrast. And the way I like to do this is first target the contrast in my sky, and then we're going to use a gradient on a layer mask to have that only affect the sky, and then we're going to do the same for the foreground. That way we can really tailor the contrast to each area of the photo. And this is another reason why I like to have things be pretty flat and even as far as brightness across my scene, before I bring the image into Photoshop, you can see that it's pretty flat and there isn't much contrast. This is just going to make it way easier for us to kind of evenly and seamlessly like have some adjustments made without it looking too obvious. That's one of the biggest things for processing, is just being subtle and not going overboard, which is a skill in of itself. So the first thing we're going to do here is we're going to add a curves adjustment mask, curves adjustment layer, I should say. I mentioned, I think, in some of the workshops just about working non-destructively. All of these adjustments here also are in this little menu system, but all of these are going to be making adjustments directly to your layer, to your image, and that's destructive. So that means that if you go through and make 15 adjustments with all these different options here, and you screw something up at the end, you're kind of stuck. I mean, you can go back to a certain point, but with the benefit of using all of these adjustments is like, if I make some heinous adjustment here and I'm 15 steps ahead, I can just delete this and have my original still intact. So that is the benefit of working non-destructively. So like I said, we're going to make a curves adjustment layer. It's this little graph looking icon here. Let's click on that. And hold on, let me get rid of this little thing here. Don't need that. So what we're going to do is we're going to add contrast by making our brights a little bit brighter and making the darks in the sky a little bit darker. And that's just going to make the Milky Way pop a little bit and make the image look nice. So I usually start somewhere around here. This doesn't need to be precise at all. Like there's no, specific area you need to start with. I just, do it right around this like 75% mark here. And just drag it up a little bit. Very subtle. You don't want to go too far because then you're going to have loss of detail in your highlights here. Especially this is like the brightest part of pretty much any Milky Way photo. You just want to make sure you're not going too hard with that. And I'm going to drag down my darks a little bit. And if you just, at any point, if you want to see the adjustments you made, you can just click the little eye icon here. That'll turn things on and off. And you can see how much, this is the benefit, one, of working in dark skies, but also, two, of having things be pretty flat in Lightroom. With a very minor adjustment, curve adjustment of adding contrast, it makes the Milky Way pop like really nicely. Unfortunately, this is going to ruin it for you shooting in anything but very dark skies. But it's always crazy to me how much detail is present pretty much in the original raw files. But I digress here. So I'm pretty happy with that. As far as an adjustment, it might be a little bit too dark up here. But I think that still looks fine. So like I said, at each point here, we're basically just targeting the sky or the foreground. And this adjustment is for the sky, so I'm going to actually double click where it says curves and just name this sky contrast. And because we're only affecting the sky, or hoping to only affect the sky, we want to add a gradient to this layer mask. That way it is only affecting the sky and we're having it not affect the foreground at all. So making sure that you're clicked on the actual layer mask here, make sure that there's like a little outline around this white box. We're going to add a gradient. Now you can either hit G or you can go to this little icon here, and you want to just make sure that you're set to black and that your opacity is turned up to 100%. You can see here that you have something that looks like this, where it starts with black and ends to white. So basically we're just going to be having a gradual effect of the foreground not being affected into the sky being affected, and the way you want to do this is you want to start a little bit below your horizon, and if you hold the shift key down, this will make sure that your line is completely straight. So you just want to click, hold, and drag a little bit above your horizon, something like this. You don't want to go too far with this, but that looks pretty good. And if we just turn this on and off, you can actually see where it's going, and that looks good to me. You can't really see where we've made that adjustment. It's like a pretty smooth transition. I'm happy with that. And at this point, we're going to do basically the same thing, but just for the foreground. So click on our layer again and go to our curve adjustment. Add a new one of those. And this time we're only going to be focusing on the foreground. Now, you don't want to have this super bright. It'll look unnatural, and obviously you'll introduce a lot of noise. It's already fairly noisy. I can see some, especially in these bottom corners. But you want to just make a subtle adjustment and bring some contrast back to that. So if I click on this and look, looks pretty good. And a lot of times these adjustments will be very similar, you know, depending on your scene as far as how much contrast the sky and foreground needs. You know, if I look at, this is my foreground mask and this is my sky mask, they're very similar, but you can see I've added a little bit more contrast, especially in the darks. So now that I have my foreground contrast pretty dialed in, I'm going to do the exact same thing with a gradient. So, you know, hitting G or just clicking this icon, but instead of dragging up from below the horizon, we're going to start above the horizon and drag down. Same exact thing. Hold shift, click, and drag a little bit just below the horizon here. And that looks pretty good to me as well. You can see a little bit of where I've made this adjustment. I might actually make this one a little bit more gradual. There we go. It's a bit more natural looking. Yep. Yep. Looks good to me. So at this point, I'm going to rename this foreground. Oops. Contrast. And I'm actually going to group these into a group, and that way it's just kind of a little bit more neat on my timeline here. If you just hold shift to click both of these and click the little group icon here, little folder, and I'm going to just name this, you know, curves / contrast, so I know what it is. And if we turn this on and off, you can see the adjustments we've made, total, all the adjustments we've made for the image so far. You can see it's more subtle for the foreground, but you can see it a lot in the sky, and that looks real nice to me. So at this point, I want to start working on some of this like purple fringing here in the bottom corners that I have. You know, depending on the sensor and how much you push your files, and there's a whole lot of different factors that can go into this, but as a rule of thumb, like if you're shooting Canon, this is probably going to be an issue that you're going to need to deal with a little bit more than if you're shooting Nikon or Sony. Don't shoot the messenger here, but there's still a little bit in mind that I need to clean up. If I zoom way in and go to the bottom corners, you can see there's just like a little bit here in the bottom. Yeah, there's like some over here especially. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a color layer, and we're going to actually brush all that purple out. So if you're going to go over to this little page icon here, it's next to the trash can. This is a create a new layer. If you just click this, and you want to change the mode of this to color, and I'm going to take out your brush tool, so you can hit B, or you can just click on the brush here. we want to zoom in quite a ways, and you want to find a color that's sort of close to where you're going to be brushing in but doesn't have any purple in it. So if I go down to the bottom here, it's kind of hard to see when I'm zoomed out, but if I zoom way into like the pixel level, you can see there's some purple down here, some magentas and just a bunch of colors that we don't want. But if I zoom up a little bit, I have kind of more flat and neutral colors, sort of like tans and grays and stuff like that, and this is what we want to sample off of. So the point here now is just to find a neutral color that we're going to brush in, and I think it's going to want to be sort of a dark, like a darker tan color. If you use something too bright, you're going to be able to see where you brushed in. You want to match the color and some of the brightness of this. So if you hold the Alt key, this gives you a little eyedropper tool. You can see that. And we're going to look around and find a color that looks good here. I'm going to go with this one. If you hold on it, it'll show you the color. It's pretty good, sort of like a gray. And if I zoom back out, I have my brush. And you don't want to start at 100% opacity. This is something that's better to sort of build on. If you need more, you can always just add another brush stroke. I'm going to start at 50% opacity here. And brush over the areas that I know are affected. You don't want to go too far in this. Like, I wouldn't want to be brushing in up here because there's no purple up here to get rid of. And it's going to just look kind of weird. Everything having like a consistent color. So let's brush in this stuff. Maybe need a little bit up there. If I turn this on and off, you can see I've actually gone a little bit too far. If I zoom in, you can see, because there's also some like green in here, which is sort of the natural color of these rocks anyway. I've done a good job at removing the purple, but I've gone a little bit too far. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to back off the opacity of the entire layer to 50%. That looks much more natural to me. Zoom back out. So that's how you get rid of the fringing. I'm just going to name this one purple fringing. Know what that means. And now we're going to actually move on to the noise reduction section, because we've done quite a bit as far as the processing here. I'm really happy with the colors. I'm happy with the contrast. That's the beauty of shooting in the dark skies, is that the processing you need is fairly minimal, especially if you're doing just a single frame like this. Where the real heavy processing comes in is if you're shooting in just not that dark of skies, and people just try to accentuate the Milky Way to make it look like it was under dark skies, but it's never the same. It never looks as good as if you just put the effort in and found somewhere dark. And again, I'm going to be going through this stuff fairly quickly just because it's meant to be a refresher, a reminder of this stuff, and not like the full workshop. That's why it's moving fairly quickly. So at this point, I want to move on to the noise reduction section. And another thing that you will have by the time that you're watching these videos is my noise reduction actions. And if you want to use those, that's just like a one-click solution. It'll be in your action panel here. And just clean some of this up, get rid of these. It'll be under the Easy NR panel, and there's a bunch of different levels of noise reduction, from light, which is, you don't really have that much at all, and extreme if you have sort of like a Hail Mary, where like you just need to make the image at least usable online, maybe. That's like absolute worst case scenario, but it's there just in case. But as good as those actions are, they're not going to be quite as good as if you just tailor the mask to each individual photo. So I'm just going to walk you through that quickly. What I want to do here is actually do a merge visible, just to get everything in one layer. It'll make it a little bit easier to work with. So on a PC that you have to hold down Shift, Control, Alt, E. On a Mac, it's Shift, Command, Option, E, I believe. And that just creates a new stamp layer. So this layer contains everything below, all these different adjustments, but just in one new layer, if that makes sense. I'm actually going to turn these off just to make things run a little bit faster. And I'm going to duplicate this layer. So again, there's a bunch of different ways you can do this, but I'm just going to click and hold and drag it here. And then we're going to bring this into Camera Raw. If I go to Filter, Camera Raw Filter, and go into the Detail panel, which is these like little triangle icons here. And I'm going to zoom pretty far in to 100%, and I'm just going to crank up this luminance slider to 50, which is too much of an adjustment. I would never bring up the luminance slider to 50 normally, but because we're going to be masking things out and only affecting the darks, it's okay to go a little bit harder on this. Okay. And now this has done the noise reduction. If I zoom in to 100%, turn this on and off, you can see how it's done a really nice job at removing noise, but it's also removed a lot of our detail, which we obviously don't want. We want to preserve as much detail as possible. So we're going to add a layer mask to this and have it only affect the darks of our photo. So if we add a layer mask with this little icon here, making sure it's on the copy, and go to Image, Apply Image, and you want to make sure, a lot of times the blending mode of this will be set to multiply. I don't understand why it has that as a default, even though I've never used it once in my life, but you want to change the blending mode to normal, and then you want to make sure that you click Invert here. This allows it so that it's affecting only the darks. By default, it's making a mask based on your brights, but we want to mask based on our dark areas because that's where the noise is. So let's hit Invert and click OK. And if I zoom back in, now that this mask has been generated, you can see that it's really only affecting the darker areas, but not really affecting any of the brights. And a lot of times Photoshop will do a good job with this, right out of the gate, but sometimes you need to make some more adjustments. So I'll just show you quickly how to do that. This is sort of more of the confusing part of noise reduction, and that's why I have the actions I give you if you don't want to deal with this, but I just want to show you how it's done. So if we need to tweak this as far as where it's affecting the image for noise reduction, if you hold Alt and click on the actual mask, this is showing you what the mask looks like. So this is kind of where it gets confusing, because everything white in this mask is where the noise reduction is being applied, and everything dark is where there's no noise reduction being applied. So because our stars are bright, are pure white, they're not being affected at all, which means they're black in this mask. It's sort of just like reverse of what you would you would typically think of. You can see the Milky Way core is bright, and because it's black in the mask, that means not really much noise reduction is being applied at all. But you can see, especially there was a lot of noise in the water, and you'll see this a lot when shooting on the coast if you're just doing one exposure. The foreground water will typically be pretty noisy. So we want to just change this slightly, that we're tailoring where the noise reduction is going. So making sure that you're clicked on the actual mask, you want to hit Control or Command M. Command if you're on a Mac, Control if you're on a PC. This will bring up a curve adjustment just for the mask. So what we want to do is we want to make these areas a little bit brighter, so that more noise reduction is being applied. But we want to also make sure that we're keeping some detail in the Milky Way core. So if I drag this up a little bit, you can see that this stuff is getting closer to white, which means more noise reduction is being applied. Actually do something like this. Bring it sort of more in the middle, because I want some of the midtones to be selected as well. But I want to keep a lot of this detail here. So if I click and hold on that and drag down, it's retaining some of the detail in the core, but it's removing a lot of the noise where we don't want any detail anyway. Once that looks pretty good, just hit OK. You click on your layer, it'll bring you back to this normal view. Zoom in. The area I try to pay most attention to is around the core, just making sure that I'm maintaining some of this detail here. That looks good. You don't want your sky to be completely smooth. It'll just look fake and unnatural. But that looks really nice as far as removing the noise that looks bad. Whoops, sorry about that. Phone's going off. And so at this point, I'm pretty happy with the noise reduction and with the contrast and everything like that. So I'm just going to quickly go over how to resize for web. I actually have an action panel that I use for this that automatically resizes for you, but I will show you how I would save this for web, if you want to share it on Facebook or something. So I'm going to create another merge visible. Shift Control Alt E or Shift Command Option E to create a new layer. I'm going to call this noise reduced, so I know where I'm at and don't try to do more noise reduction on an image that doesn't need it. And I'm actually going to copy this entire thing and paste it on a new document. That way you have this as is, and you could actually save things at this point if you wanted to. That way, like, you have your master process file, and then if you need to prepare it for print, then you can work on a new thing, or if you need to prepare it for web, you can work on a new copy of this, but you always have your original if you need to. I'm not going to save it because this is part of a panorama that I did anyway. I don't really need the single image, but you could of course go up and do save as and go through all that stuff. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit Control or Command, if you're on a Mac, hit A. That's going to just do a select all, and do Command or Control C. That's copy. You can just click out of this if you want. And I'm going to go to New. And create a new one. So when you select all on your layer and copy all of this, Photoshop knows it's going to have this little clipboard option. This is the dimensions of what you just copied, so it kind of knows what you're doing. And you can hit Command or Control V, or there's probably a paste thing up here and edit as well. And we want to resize this for web. Now there's a few different ways you can do this, but I'm going to go to Image Size, and we want to change this to pixels. So I had mentioned before during the workshops that there's kind of different sizes you want to keep things at. So depending on your image, so we're working on a vertical image here, and for vertical images you want the height to be 960. These are the sizes at which Facebook won't resize them and compress them any further. I'm not sure why for vertical images it needs to be so much smaller, because if this was a horizontal image, you'd want the width to be 2048. But because we're working on vertical, I'm going to go with 960. I just leave the resampling at automatic. This stuff matters more if you're like resizing for prints, and there's a whole bunch that goes into that, but just because it's a vertical, we're going to go with 960, leave this at automatic, make sure this is at 300, hit OK. Good. One thing that Photoshop will do quite a bit when you're resizing, especially when you're making things smaller, it'll actually sharpen it up a little bit. So that's a nice bonus here. And then for saving for web, you want to go to Export, Save for Web, Legacy. Just hit OK. Actually, real quick, just before I do this, I think this image could use a little bit more saturation. Sorry to jump around a little bit, but this is sort of important. Where this stuff lives, there's a few different ways you can add saturation. My favorite is the hue saturation layer here. Just going to hit this and then just kind of add some saturation. You don't want to go too far in this. Please do not do that. Like, don't go up to, you know, anything like this. 25 is probably the most I would ever add. I usually stay around like 15. And if, you know, something to keep in mind is if it's adding too much saturation to your foreground, you can always add a gradient just like we did before. And because we're trying to keep the effect in the sky but not in the foreground, you'd start below the horizon and just drag up. That looks a little bit better to me. Just noticed that at the end. Sorry to skip around a little bit, but I noticed it looked a little bit flat. So back to the saving for web. You want to go to Export, Save for Web, Legacy, and then just make sure that this is set to JPEG. I always use the maximum quality, optimized. Make sure that's clicked. Make sure that it's converting to sRGB. That's the web color space. If you try to save it as Adobe RGB, your images are going to look really bad because web browsers can't display Adobe RGB. They display sRGB. Color spaces can be a little bit confusing, but all you need to know is that for web, you want to be in sRGB. And then just save. Save it to wherever you want, and just hit save, and that is that. So that is the single image processing. After this, we're going to be going over some of the other techniques, but as I said, this is sort of more of the intricate tutorial we're going to be going over. Everything else is sort of just building off of this, so this one's going to be a little bit longer, but we'll move on to the next topic in a second here. Alright, so now we're going to go over the panorama blending. And as I mentioned before, you know, the first video on processing single images is going to be the longest because basically all of these other processes are just building off of single image processing. So these are going to be a little bit faster because, you know, for example, once you get your panorama stitched in Lightroom, the adjustments you're going to make in Photoshop to the stitch panorama are going to be the same as your single image processing. So we won't be going over quite as much for these next couple videos. I have this raw image here. You can recognize this from the last one. I had mentioned that was just a still frame from a panorama. So now we're actually going to work on the entire panorama. So the first thing I do is just get, you know, my first image of my sequence, you know, roughly processed, and then we're going to sync those adjustments to the rest of your sequence and then stitch it together. So again, first thing I'm going to do is increase my brightness, my exposure slightly, depending on what you shot at. You know, a lot of times I'll add just like one stop of exposure. Sometimes I don't need quite as much. I shot this at 12,800, so it's already fairly bright. I'm going to tone down the highlights slightly to keep some of that detail. Push our shadows a little bit and push our whites slightly. Dial in that white balance. I remember being somewhere around here. Maybe a little bit more magenta. Looks good. And again, the nice thing about blending images in Lightroom, as far as your panoramas, is that it spits out an entirely new raw file. So if you need to like dial back any of these adjustments after everything is stitched, you can, which is awesome. And I'm gonna turn on some of my lens profile corrections, fix some of that vignetting. Looks pretty good. And yep, so these are pretty much all the adjustments I'm going to make for this single image. You just want to go back to your grid view here, and starting with the first image, you want to make sure that's selected, hold shift and click on the last image of your sequence and click sync settings. Make sure you hit check all, that way everything is being synced. And I'm just going to give that a second to sync the adjustments for the rest of them. Yep, all set. And then a couple different ways you can do this. You can either right click on this, or you can just go to Photo, Photo Merge, Panorama. Oops, this window is a little bit too big for my screen recording software. Let me resize this quickly. And it'll take a second depending on how many megapixels your camera has and how fast your computer is and stuff. It's analyzing quite a bit of data, so sometimes it takes a little while. And that did an okay job. My camera, my tripod was pretty level. This was sort of a rush job. This was actually taken, I think, the night after our workshop. Oh, sorry if that motorcycle driving by is loud in the video. Yeah, this was taken, I think, the night after our workshop ended, and we got to the spot a little bit late, and the Milky Way was already pretty high, so I had to get this set up and run these images quickly before the Milky Way was too high up in the sky. So I might have done, I could have done a little bit of a better job leveling my tripod. That's why you can see some of the stuff around the edges where it didn't stitch correctly, but luckily, against all odds, this actually stitched fairly well. So I always leave things at spherical. That's the standard projection. You can click through the other projection models, but I typically find that spherical works well. Cylindrical looks really weird. Perspective, yeah, it didn't even work. So stick with the spherical projection. See how much the cylindrical just really screwed things up. It's no good. And I don't really use the auto crop, just because as you can see, it doesn't. It's just gonna guess where you want your crop to be, and this did a poor job. It cut off the top of our panorama. So I don't click this. I don't click the boundary warp because, as you can see here, this is actually a really good example of this. What it'll do, it'll fill in all these gaps by just warping everything around your edges. But depending on your photo, sometimes it'll stretch things out too much. You can see it added some distortion here. And we could fix this, but I'd rather just start off with something that looks right. So you just hit merge. And Lightroom is going to go through. This usually takes a minute just to stitch the panorama. Alright, actually pause the video and just let this do its thing and load, because it took a little while. It's a fairly big panorama, so Now Lightroom has finished stitching everything, and I'm going to choose my crop that I want. And I typically like to use a standard aspect ratio. For panoramas, that's usually either 2:1 or 3:1. I'm going to try 3:1. I think that works really well for these types of photos. Quickly going to level the horizon best I can. I actually already processed this image once, and sometimes it can be really frustrating because like right here below my horizon where the Milky Way is actually reflecting a little bit off the ocean, it's a little bit brighter and it can throw off your perception of what is level. So that can be fun to deal with. So try 3:1. This actually might end up working better as a 2:1. Let's see how that works. So I want to have some foreground, but I also obviously want to have the full arch. So let's see what 2:1 looks like. Yeah, we'll go with something like this. I try to have sort of an even amount of space on each side of the Milky Way arch. So like I have a little bit of space right here, and then I also have a little bit of space right here. The northern end of the Milky Way is obviously a little bit fainter, so it can be hard to see, but let's try to get that close. And I'll just stretch things out basically as far as I can. That looks good to me. Which is nice, keeping things in like a standard aspect ratio. That way, if you want to print it, it's easy to do so. You can see what I was talking about. Like, it looks like the horizon's not level, and I think that's kind of partly due to some of like the brightness and the reflection here. But if I pull up my crop tool, and it actually gives me that line, looks like I'm pretty close. Yeah, that looks good. Hit OK. Now, at this point, I would just take the photo into Photoshop and start doing the same adjustments that we did before. So you would do Edit in Photoshop CC. I'm really not going to go over this entire thing just because we just went over all of the processing for single images, and it's basically the same idea, but just quickly, like very quickly, I'll show you kind of what I mean. So, clone out some of these satellites. I had quite a few fly through my frame during this panorama. Get rid of all these. And, yep. Again, this one kind of went through the core, so I'm going to go a little bit slower with this. That way it doesn't kind of squash too much detail here. Looks pretty good. This panorama is actually pretty cool too, because you have one of our neighboring galaxies, Andromeda, which is usually visible sort of later in the summer, sort of to the north. It's kind of faint, but you can see it right there. It's pretty cool. And like I said, just like before, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to add some contrast to the sky. Something like that. Add a gradient and just drag it up so it's only affecting the sky. Do the same thing for our foreground. And you can see like how quickly you can run through these adjustments once you figure them out. Quickly add some contrast, maybe add like a touch of saturation, 15, something like that. And then you would go through the noise reduction and all that stuff that we just went over in the last image. But processing panoramas, other than the stitching part, is it's pretty standard. Same thing you would do for your single images. So that is all I'm going to cover for this part. Then we'll move on to the blended exposures, which is a little bit more intricate. So Alright, so now we're going to move on to processing blended images. So this is just when you take, your normal sky exposure. In this case, I have an exposure for 15 seconds at 24 millimeters at ISO 10,000. This is just for my sky so that I get, my pinpoint stars, or as close as I possibly can get to pinpoint stars. And then we have another image that is taken at ISO 2000, 24 millimeters, for a few minutes. I think this was 5-6 minutes, something like that. By dropping the ISO down, you're going to get a cleaner image. And obviously, by doing a much longer exposure, you're going to pick up a lot more detail. This is what the photo looked like straight out of camera. So quite a bit brighter, definitely quite a bit cleaner. As far as like noise in the foreground, there's going to be some because you're shooting at ISO 2000, but it's much better than taking an exposure at ISO 10,000 and for 15 seconds and then just pushing your shadows a bunch. When I zoomed in here, there was a bunch of these hot pixels. I posted that video before about how to remove those, so I'm not going to be going over that. But the first thing we want to do here is make just a couple quick adjustments to your foreground exposure. You're going to set your white balance. This can be a little bit trickier just because you have to pay attention to just the foreground. We're not really concerned with the sky. You just want to make sure that your foreground colors look natural and you don't have like an overwhelming color cast. At night, obviously things tend to be a little bit kind of on the bluer, like colder side, just because there's no light on any of these features, obviously. So white balance still tends to be pretty low. I might bump this up to like 3800. That looks fine to me. I'm gonna push my shadows just a little bit. Maybe not quite that much, something like that. 25%. This is going to vary on each image, but you don't want it to be super bright because when we're bringing these images into Photoshop, you want them to be sort of consistent brightness. You don't want one to be darker than the other. We add that contrast later in Photoshop, so I'm not going to play around with the exposure too much, maybe just a tiny bit. And I'm going to drop my highlights slightly. You can see it's pretty bright here along the horizon. That's one of the biggest mistakes I see, is that people leave their horizon too bright where it meets the sky, and it just looks kind of funky and weird. So we're going to drop the highlights down and remove the chromatic aberration. I'm not going to mess with the vignetting at all because I think having a little bit of vignetting in your foreground is okay. I don't think it looks bad, so I'm not even going to touch that at all. And I'm going to leave this pretty much as is, but I'm going to sync the settings with my sky frame. Mostly just to get that match of the white balance. But I'm going to reset all of these. I'm going to push my exposure about a stop for my sky. I'm going to push my whites, just like we did with the single image processing. Getting things pretty consistent. I am going to do the vignetting correction just for my sky frame. Probably won't need quite as much as the last image we worked on. That looks pretty good. Yep, so I'm happy with that. At this point, I'm going to bring both of these into Photoshop. So what you want to do is you want to right click, making sure that both are selected, and click Edit In, Open as Layers in Photoshop. And this is just going to stack them on top of each other automatically for us. And should bring the other one in hopefully soon. Here we go. This is when things get like real tricky. I'm going to close this panorama because I'm done working on that. This is where things can get a little bit tricky and you know, very intricate, honestly, depending on what you have in your scene. I chose this image because it's a little bit harder. We have to mask around these trees, which can present a fun little challenge. But if you see, this is my foreground and this is my sky. I turn this on and off. Everything lines up. We just need to blend in our sky. So turn this back on, and there's a few different ways you can do these. You know, if you are really lucky and you have an easy scene to work with, you can just add a layer mask to your foreground, and with a gradient tool you can just drag the sky back in, and this looks okay. You know, like, this isn't bad. You know, it certainly looks fine to me. You could actually even add like a really big gradient to make that transition look even more natural. And this will work fine for a lot of images, but I'm going to show you another way to go about this. So I just deleted that. I'm going to add the layer mask again. So with a scene like this where you have sort of trickier stuff to blend around, as far as, like, you know, you have these trees and there's all these little spaces and stuff in between them. This is the area I'm going to target first, and then I'm going to worry about this easier stuff over here, because this stuff will be like pretty easy to blend along the horizon and so forth, but obviously this is going to be pretty tricky. And the way I like to go about this is by using a color range selection, where Photoshop is going to search for colors and then make the selection based off of that, and then you can mask around. And it works really well for stuff like trees, where they tend to be darker along the horizon anyway, and more of a consistent color. You can see there's really nice color separation between the trees we have here and the background sky. So making sure that I'm clicked on the sky layer, we're going to go to Select, Color Range, and automatically it's going to be selected on this. This is like the eyedropper tool. This is how you start your selection. Your fuzziness you can leave around like 35–40%. You don't want to go too high on that. And you just want to click on an area in your sky. And you can see this is like a preview of what our mask is going to look like. And you can see it did a decent job, but there's still, you know, the white, anything pure white is what's being selected. It's leaving a lot behind. So I'll just start, you know, here, whatever. And then you want to click on the plus icon eyedropper. This is how you add to your selection. I'm just going to slowly drag around and just keep an eye on your mask here. You want to make sure that you're getting a clean selection and it's not going over into your trees. I'm not super concerned about this area right here because we're only focusing on, you know, the more difficult spot to blend. That looks good to me, where it has a nice clean selection around your horizon. Looks nice to me right here. And of course, let's say, you know, you went too far and you like clicked on an area you weren't supposed to. Unfortunately, you have to start over, but this is a relatively quick process anyway. So you would just click on this little icon to start over, and then just drag around. Yep, that looks good to me. Just hit OK. And you can see it's made a really good selection. It selected all of those areas of color in between all your branches. You know, it did leave a little bit behind. You know, it didn't select some of these stars, but most of the heavy lifting has been done already. It's really just a great tool. So we're going to click on the layer mask, and with a black brush at 100% opacity, make sure that's selected, we're going to start just brushing around the trees. Actually zoom out. It didn't do a perfect job in the sky, but like I said, all I'm concerned about at the moment is right here. And if you actually hit Command or Control D, once you've kind of brushed some of this stuff in, it'll deselect that, and now you can go in and start like brushing in all the areas that have missed. Looks pretty good. And now what I'll do for scenes like this, now that it's done the most important part of masking around the trees, I'm going to deal with the horizon here. So actually what I'm going to do is just create a gradient because that will make a smooth transition for basically everything from this little spot over. So if I take my marquee tool, this is a little rectangle here, and drag, just want to make sure that you're stopping here right at this tree, or whatever you have in your horizon. Click back on the mask, and then with a gradient, this one we're not going to start as far above the horizon because if we get too much of the foreground exposure in this mask, you can see where, because it was a 5-minute exposure, we're getting a bunch of this trailing. I'm going to start just a little bit above it and then drag down. And if I deselect, did an okay job. I'm just going to clean this up with the black brush where it kind of missed some stuff. Yep, all cleaned up. And just on the sky layer, just going to remove some of these. Yep, that's pretty good. And now if I zoom back out, you can see if I turn this layer mask on and off, it did a really nice job. We're getting a little bit of some of the sky frame coming into our horizon, but that keeps it looking a little bit more natural, having that smooth transition between your sky and your foreground. And at this point you can start trying to match some of the brightness to make that look even more smooth. So I noticed that my sky is a little bit darker than the foreground, and that is causing some issues just as far as the blending line. So if you click on your sky layer and just add a curve adjustment to that, you can make, again, just like a subtle little adjustment, make it slightly brighter, add a little bit of contrast. You can see how subtle my curve adjustment is. It's like I've barely done anything to it. But that's made it look a little bit more natural as far as the blend in between your sky and foreground. And that's looking pretty good to me. So at this point I would just do a merge visible. Shift Control Alt E or Shift Command Option E if you're on a Mac. And this will create a stamp layer, so you could just rename this. I keep doing that. You can rename this, blended exposure, whatever, help you remember what it is. And this is the reason, just like on the single image processing, why I try to keep things pretty flat and consistent as far as contrast and brightness between my sky and foreground exposure. That just makes it easier when you're doing your blending to match things up. And then if you want to go in and start, making like more contrast adjustments, it just makes it more consistent, and it makes it harder to see where you blended your exposures. And that's like the biggest thing, is just keeping things natural looking and not having it be obvious where you've blended exposures together. This is looking pretty awesome to me. Now that we've got those two together, and like I said, just adding a gradient to your blended exposures will work a lot of times, but I wanted to go over one of the more difficult types of scenes to blend. Trees are usually the most difficult thing to work around, so I wanted to go over that just to show everyone how that works. And again, now that you have things blended together into your master blended exposure file, then you can go through and start making all your typical adjustments the same way you did for your single exposures. So that is how you want to do your blends. So now we're going to go over how to stack multiple images to reduce noise. Now, this is basically the best way at reducing noise in your astro images. This will do a much better job than any other noise reduction technique, but it's not always possible to do so. If you have clouds moving through your frame, for example, Photoshop is going to have a really hard time aligning all of your layers. Because it's going to try to align your clouds and stuff. So it doesn't always work. It's not always an option, but if you have a nice, cloudless night like this, it works really well. And you basically just want to take, 3 or 4. 4 is usually the number I go for. Exposures in a row at the same settings. And you want to make sure you do this one after another. That way there's not too much movement in between your stars, which is going to cause some issues. This is actually a frame from a time lapse, so it was just taking exposures basically over and over with only like a second or two in between each shot. So this will work really well for this. This was an image we took, I don't know, 2 days after the workshop ended in Acadia. Some nice clear skies, so Chris and I ran down to Eagle Lake. It was a really nice night. So I'm not going to go over much of the adjustments because it's going to be similar to the same type of adjustments you made for a single image. I pushed my exposure a little bit, dropped my highlights, pushed my whites, dialed in the white balance how I liked it. Did my lens corrections, all the same stuff that we've gone over. The only difference that I want to go over for when you're stacking images like this. By default, when you bring images into Lightroom, it automatically applies 25% of your color noise, which does a really nice job. Normally this is fine, like I never touch this unless I'm doing the stacking, but I found that by dropping your color noise down to 0, it's going to do a much better job at aligning, because this is actually going to smooth out some of the things that Photoshop looks for alignment. So you want to drop that back down to 0. It does make each image slightly more noisy. But because we're going to be doing the alignment, it's not going to matter. It's going to all even out in the end. So this is really the only difference as far as preparing your images in Lightroom, is you just want to drop down your color noise slider to 0. And Chris and I do things like slightly different. I know he usually goes over this technique during the workshop. Basically the same thing, but there might be like slight differences you might remember from when he went over it and when I'm about to go over it, but it's basically the same thing. So once you've made your adjustments to your first frame, you just want to hold Shift to select the rest of your sequence and just hit Sync Settings. So make sure that every photo is exactly the same that we're going into. And once the settings are all synced, you just want to right click on any of the images and click Edit in, Open as Layers in Photoshop, and that'll bring things over into Photoshop for us. This might take a second. Alright, so I skipped ahead a little bit just to let Photoshop bring all these images in. Now this is going to be one of the biggest differences in how Chris does this and I do this. It's really not a huge difference, it's just I like to keep everything within Photoshop. I know he likes to bring some of the stuff back into Lightroom. But what I'm going to do is just hold Shift to select all of my layers. And we're going to duplicate these, so you can do Control or Command J, or you can just drag them all down to this little page icon. And that's just going to create a copy of these. And I'm actually going to turn off one set of them, because now we have 8 images in our workspace here, but we only need 4. So you're just making sure that you're working on either all of the copies or all of the originals. For this case, I'm going to be working on all the copies. So now we want to mask out our foreground. That way Photoshop isn't trying to align our foreground, because if it does that, then we're going to have a bunch of movement in our stars. So we want to add a layer mask to the top layer here, and take a brush, a black brush, and I like to turn my hardness up to 100% for this. And this doesn't need to be super precise, as long as we just make sure that we're getting rid of any foreground objects, which obviously don't move during these photos. just want to brush over this. Actually, if I turn these layers off, I'll be able to see where I'm going. And just brush out all of your foreground. Like I said, it doesn't have to be like super precise, as long as there's no foreground in your shot. And if I turn these back on, and if you hold Alt and click on the actual layer mask and just drag it down, it's just going to copy that layer mask to these other 4 images. And hold Shift to select this sequence set, these 4 images, and we're going to go to Edit, Auto Align Layers. And this should align everything based on the stars. So we did a pretty good job. If I zoom in, there might be some slight movement in between things, but not really. Looks pretty good to me. It can be kind of hard to see. You sort of learn how to see this stuff because the noise is going to move. The noise pattern will be different in each image, and sometimes it can just look a little weird because the noise is actually moving. But that looks good to me. And at this point we can actually delete just by right clicking on each layer mask and just do delete layer mask. Good. And we're going to hold Shift to select all of these layers. And this is what we're going to be working on this sequence set for our stars, and then we're going to be doing this for our foreground. So making sure that just one set of images is selected, the ones that you just did the auto alignment to. You're going to right click and convert these to a smart object. And this might take a few minutes depending on your computer. I know Chris's computer is very fast, that's why we bring that one for the workshops. Mine is a little bit slower. And so now I skipped ahead a little bit. I just paused the video, let Photoshop do its thing. It's converted those 4 layers into a smart object. So now we're going to go to Layer, Smart Objects, Stack Mode, and you want to do a median stack. Basically what that's doing is just averaging out all the noise. Because the noise pattern is different between each frame, it's going to just average all of that out, and we should get a much cleaner look. And let's see how this is. I'll turn one of these other layers on so we can see. They won't be aligned completely, like perfectly, but you'll be able to see the difference, especially in noise. This did like a really, really nice job. So if I turn this on and off, you can see there's movement because we've aligned things. But you can also see, if I zoom in to 100%, might be a little bit difficult to see in the video, but there's like a significant change in noise. Turn this back on. You can see how much it's smoothed out all of the noise in the sky. It just does an incredible job. Like I said, as long as you don't have clouds moving through your frame, it's a good idea to stack these frames like this. But if I zoom in way further, it's actually moved some of my foreground slightly. It's made that a little bit noisy. Not noisy, but there's movement, I should say. So what we're going to do now is we're actually going to do the same thing for our foreground. We don't need to align these because there shouldn't be any movement in between these shots anyway. If I scrub through these, the noise varies slightly, but there's no movement in our foreground features. So if I just hold Shift to select all of these, we will convert this to a smart object. Again, it's working with some bigger files, especially if you're using, one of the higher megapixel cameras. This can take a few minutes. So now the smart object is created for our foreground. We're going to do the same thing. We're going to go to Layer, Smart Objects, Stack Mode, and median. And this will hopefully get rid of all of our noise for our foreground. See how good of a job this does. Typically your foregrounds are a little bit noisier than your sky, so there may still be a little bit of noise, but it should do a nice job at removing most of it. And let's let this finish up. There we go. So you can see why you need to align things just for your stars, because, whoops. So did a good job for our foreground at removing some of the noise. If I turn that on and off, you can see this is the original before we did the median stack, and this is with the median stack. Again, you'll see more noise in your foreground than you do in your sky, but you can see because we didn't align for the stars, because of the movement in between frames, it's gonna make your stars blurry. So this is my sky exposure, this is my foreground. So we're actually gonna rename this sky foreground, so that way we know. And I'm actually going to auto align both of these. It might not let me. I have to rasterize these. Rasterize layer. So this is just something you need to do to be able to align stuff once you've created it as a smart object. We're done with the smart object part, so we can rasterize both of these. So if you right click on it and rasterize layer and rasterize layer, there we go. And now we can actually auto align them again because there was a little bit of movement in the alignment. So we'll just go to auto align, hit OK. Just make sure this worked. Yep, worked perfectly. So at this point, we need to mask out, we need to do some masking and blending just to get these to line up exactly the way we want. So I'm actually going to drag my foreground to the top, create a layer mask, and I'm going to use the quick select tool. This is like a really easy blend just because we have a defined foreground and sky along the horizon. And just with a black brush, I'm going to bring this back down to 0% hardness, which is like the typical settings I use. Just make sure I'm at 100% opacity and just brush back in the sky. Perfect. That looks good. This worked really well for this. You can see just how clean the file is. Now you might need to go in, at the very end and maybe do a little bit of noise reduction for your foreground, but it's much cleaner than it was before, and the sky is certainly much cleaner. You can see we have some of this extra space from the alignment around the edge of our image. If we do a merge visible, so Shift Control Alt E or Shift Command Option E, create a stamp layer. And we're going to take the crop tool, which is this little icon here, and just drag it down slightly to get rid of some of the extra space around the edge of the image. Just enter. Perfect. And let's rename this to stacked, or whatever title you please. And at this point, if you wanted to make any of your typical adjustments that you would in Photoshop, just like we did for the single images, this is the point that you would do so. So if I wanted to add some more contrast via curve adjustment for the sky, can do that. Add our gradient, do the same thing for our foreground. Add a gradient from the sky. And I'm going through this really quickly because, as I said, this is sort of just building off of the stuff that we had done before. Maybe add a touch of saturation. And that is it. If I actually bring in one of these signal images again, so you can kind of see the difference. Now, because I'm working with some bigger files, my computer's not really agreeing with me here. I'm just going to pause this. So just to show you a reference, sort of a before and after, to show you how much of a difference the stacking technique will use. I actually brought in one of the original layers. So this is like just the file that was done with the Lightroom adjustments, just a single frame. And I put it on top of the work we just did. The alignment might be slightly off, but you'll be able to see the difference in noise for sure. So this is the original that we worked with, and this is the blended one. And you can see how much of a difference that made in noise. It just really smoothed things out quite a bit if we go up to the sky. So this is the original without any stacking done, and this is the stacked exposure. You can see how much of a difference that made. So that is our stacking. Alright, so I'm just going to quickly go over how to install and use the noise reduction that I'm going to send out to everyone. So once you've downloaded the action and you want to bring it into Photoshop, you need to go to this little play icon here, the Actions panel. And if you don't have that, you can just go to Window and then just click Actions. And to bring the action into Photoshop, you just want to click this little icon here with like the 3 or 4 lines, whatever that is, and go to Load Actions. And then you just need to pull it up wherever you downloaded it to. You know, maybe it's in your Downloads folder or something. And you just want to double click on the action set. It's going to be called Easy NR. It'll look like this. I already have it in here, so I'm not going to click on it, but you would just double click on this. And then, once you have an image that you want to do some noise reduction on, so actually I just took the stack that we went over. Doesn't really need a whole lot of noise reduction, but just for the sake of showing you how it works, I actually did a merge visible to create like a new stamp layer. So I have that here. And you go to the little play icon, and you find Easy NR. And then you want to open this up with this little arrow. Here you have the varying levels of noise reduction you can apply. Most images I find need either light or medium noise. The heavy or the extreme noise ones are like just last case. Like, it's just, if you're really trying to save an image, it definitely won't be printable, but maybe you have a really noisy image that's really cool that you want to just make acceptable for sharing online. That's what these are for. But I'm going to go with the light noise because we already did the stacking, so it probably did a pretty good job. I know there's a little bit of noise left in the foreground. So you just click on the light noise and you click the play icon here. This is just going to run through the entire process for you and create a duplicate layer with your noise reduction applied. So it's already done. You can see it has a new layer called light noise. That way you remember what you did. And if I zoom in, turn this on and off, maybe not quite aggressive enough. If that's not enough, you can just delete that and go to medium noise and hit play. Now, really the best way to do it is to do it manually, the way I went over during the single image section. But if you don't want to do that, this does a fairly good job of doing the noise reduction, but it's never going to be as good as tailoring it to each image that you have. The medium noise looked like it did a much better job, so I'm going to go with that. So that's just a quick thing. I just mostly wanted to show you how to install and use it, and just remember that it lives in your Actions panel.